I was hoping to be able to share this with some professional background and some video and some all kinds of things, but it didn't work out that way. So I decided to just go ahead and go for it and read this and hope it's a blessing to you. Now, throughout the years, I've read this story, and I'm always impressed by the way that it impacts people's lives. In fact, I wish I could say that it was my auditory skills that the credit lies, but the truth is it's about who the story is about that's the impact. And also, to a great extent, by the original storyteller himself, Paul Harvey. Before I share this allegory, I want to encourage you to also listen at the end, because there's a story after the story, or as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, about a little boy who was abused, abandoned, left alone many times during what should have been a glorious time of year, Christmas. It was that type of impact that caused this little boy to, as a man, to hate and despise Christmas. That was until he experienced the healing made available to him by the only one who could give it. So this story has been adapted many times, but the message remains the same. And it starts off with Job 12:17, or I'm sorry, 12:7. Ask the birds of the sky, and they will tell you. Now, the man to whom I'm going to introduce you to is not a Scrooge, but a kind and decent man. Many would consider him a good man. He was generous to his family and upright in his dealings to his fellow men. He was a practical man, so when his wife asked him to join her for Christmas service, he realized he couldn't go. He just didn't believe all the incarnation stuff the churches proclaimed at this time of year. It just didn't make sense to him, and he was too honest of a man to pretend otherwise. His practical mind just could not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm truly sorry to upset you, he told his wife, but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve. He said he'd feel like a hypocrite and that he'd much rather just stay home, and he would wait up for them. As they drove away, he waved and then went back into his warm house. It began to snow, so he was in front of his fireplace, a warm fire that greeted him, with open arms. And at the window, he began to see that the snow was getting heavier and heavier. So he snuggled up next to the fire, got a good book to read, and decided he was going to finish the night that way. A few minutes later, all of a sudden he heard a thud, and another thud, and another thud. He could not figure out what it was. He thought, well, maybe somebody's throwing snowballs against his living room window. When he went to the door, though, he found instead a flock of birds huddling miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm, and in a desperate search for shelter, they tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, and he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. Now that would provide a warm shelter. If only he could just get the birds to get in there. He put his coat on, his galoshes, trampled through the deep snow, going to the barn, and opened it wide, turned on the light, looked at the birds, and they did nothing. He figured, well, I'll give some food to them. So he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, sprinkled some on the snow, making a trail all the way into the nice warm barn. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the bread and continued to flap helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them around. He tried to walk around them, waving his arms like a crazy person. But instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the warm, lit barn. He scratched his head trying to figure out why they wouldn't go in the barn. After all, it just made sense. It was practical. He soon realized that, well, maybe it's because they're afraid of me. To them, he reasoned, I'm a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me. That is an idea. Now, he couldn't figure out how to do it. He went out again. He tried to rush them in, and nothing he did worked. He said, if only they would realize that I'm not trying to hurt them, but I'm trying to help them. Every move he made frightened them and confused them. They just would not follow him. They would not be led. They would not be shooed. And it all was because they feared him. He said to himself, if only I could be a bird and mingle with them and speak their language, then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to be safe and go into the barn. But then I'd have to be one of them. Well, they'd have to see me, and they'd have to hear me, and they'd have to understand me. And as he pondered that, it was at that exact moment the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sound of the rushing wind, and he stood there listening to the bells pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. It was then that the understanding of why Christ came sunk in. He sank to his knees in the deepening snow and asked God to forgive him for his hardness of heart. He asked him to come into his heart, and he was changed. That was The Man and the Birds by Paul Harvey. Now, the rest of the story, as I said in the very beginning, that young man you probably figured was me. And because I grew up at a place called the Masonic Home, and we had over 150 different students there and that lived there on campus. And 2 years at least that I remember, maybe 3, there it was just unusual, but every student, every person that was in that campus had somebody to go spend the Christmas holidays with, but one person. And you guess who that is. And it just really had an impact on my life. And I began to just could not understand why that would happen all this time, this great joy. And it impacted me. And as an adult, it became, just overwhelming. And so when Thanksgiving would be here, I enjoyed Thanksgiving, a lot of turkey, a lot of good food. But when turkey and all that was over with, I realized Christmas was around the corner, and it was a terrible time of year. It wasn't until the day came when I realized that the Lord had gone through this same sort of thing himself and understood exactly what it was like to be abandoned and to be left alone. And it was at that time and through some counseling and some other things that I was able to get past all that. And now to this day, I can honestly say that I enjoy this time of year more than anything else. It's a tremendous time of year. I enjoy it. I'm so blessed with my wife, Karen, to celebrate this time of year. And I just pray, my prayer for you is if you're watching this video and this story has in some way touched your life, I pray that this testimony will give you hope as well, that there is hope, that no matter how much you might have gone through or have experienced in your life, there is a day, there is a time coming when there is hope for you, and that is through Jesus Christ. So my prayer is that this season you choose to unwrap the greatest gift of all, and that is the gift of salvation. So I pray that you give your life to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Thank you.